World War II was characterized by blitzkrieg, firebombing, and total war. Vietnam was characterized by counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare. The War on Terror is characterized by counterintelligence, special operations, and drone strikes. World War I was an interesting era of warfare, however, because it was long, bloody, and brutal, yet it was also very unique in a lot of ways. So what really characterized World War I?
From 1914 to 1918, the world was embroiled in a world war. But World War I itself was the end of a tactical era of warfare.
World War I was the end of an era of tactical, broad-line, infantry-based warfare. World War I was all about infantry numbers and virtually little else. Germany had employed 11 million troops, Russia 12 million, Great Britain almost 9 million, the United States almost 4.5 million, and France almost 8.5 million. A good portion of the numbers from World War II, however, were in other combative roles, Navy, Air Force, etc. At the height of their forces in World War II, Russia had employed almost 7 million deployed ground troops. World War I was a big tactical numbers game between armies, whereas a war like Korea was based on an ideological dispute and guerrilla tactics through counterinsurgency. Another thing that largely ended was the element of trench warfare. The standard method of fighting was defensive fighting, or trench warfare. Trenches were used as a means to defend large groups of soldiers from World War I's newest weapon, the machine gun.
Although the trenches were hardly new to combat, prior to the advent of firearms and artillery, they were used as defensive attacks, and such as moats surrounding castles.
Trench warfare was grueling. The Western Front in particular between France and Germany largely did not move during the war because of these weapons. Trench warfare was essentially an infantry meat grinder costing tons of lives with little payback in eventual land grab.
As it went, it wasn't a question of if I get killed. It was merely a question of when I get killed. Because a battalion went over 800 strong, you lost 300 or 400, half the number, perhaps more. Now it wasn't a question of saying, I am one of the survivors, hurrah, hurrah, because you didn't go home. Out came another draft of 400, and you went over the top again.
The First World War was based in the trenches, whereas a war like World War II was not fought in the trenches. It was fought in cities, in the air, and in tank battles. Sure, there were some trenches, but it was not the primary form of warfare. Another way in which World War I ended an era was the tactical nature of the battles. Essentially, there were big infantry lines. They would spend some time firing back and forth. Then one or both trenches would go on a big offensive across no man's land. If one side prevailed, they won another trench, but that was virtually it. It was very reminiscent of Victorian-era warfare. Shoot until the enemy is close enough to charge them. No other war has been fought quite like this method of trench warfare since the end of World War I. The First World War was the end of a tactical era of warfare. Large lines of troops in trenches dissipated as the primary method moving forward.
World War I may have been the end of a tactical era of warfare, but it happened to be the beginning of a mechanical era of warfare.
The days of muskets and wagons were sent off stage right. Enter the machine gun. Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim was an American-born British inventor and the creator of the first portable fully automatic machine gun, the Maxim gun, in 1884. Virtually each fighting force utilized some version of the machine gun. The Germans used the Bergmann MB-15NA with a rate of fire of almost 600 rounds per minute. The U.S. used the Colt Browning, and the British used the Vickers machine gun with a rate of fire of almost 500 rounds per minute. World War I was also the first war to utilize planes, albeit in a limited fashion. The Germans used planes like the Gotha GV long-range German bomber or the Fokker Eindecker single-seat German fighter plane. The British used planes like the Handley Page 0400 long-range British bomber or the Sopwith Camel single-seat British fighter plane. The British were the first fighting force to actually utilize airplanes in the First World War. Germany also employed the use of U-boats. For British merchant vessels operating during World War I, few things were so terrifying as the submarine. The German Navy used the U-boat to sink 5,000 ships measuring more than 13 million gross register tons during the war. Chemical warfare was also a new component of war, during the First World War. Although there were several types of chemical warfare weapons used in the First World War, the most widely reported and perhaps the most effective chemical agent of this war was sulfur mustard, known as mustard gas. It was a volatile, oily liquid introduced by the Germans in July of 1917. This weapon further increased the horrors of the trenches.
The trench was a horrible sight. The dead were stretched out on one side, one on top of each other 6 feet high. I thought at the time I could never get the peculiar, disgusting smell of the vapor of warm human blood heated by the sun out of my nostrils. I would rather have smelt gas 100 times. I could never describe that faint, sickening, horrible smell which several times nearly knocked me out altogether.
The First World War was a horror of gas, industrialized slaughter, fear, and appalling human suffering.
World War I may have been the end of a tactical era of warfare and the beginning of a mechanical era of warfare. But seeing as it set the stage for the remainder of the 20th century, and the start date is up for much debate, perhaps the end date of World War I is too.